What if the most explosive words about Jesus were never placed in the Bible at all? And what if the missing story was not about his death, but about what he said after he came back? If this kind of hidden history pulls you in, tap like, subscribe, and share this video with the one friend who loves asking the questions other people avoid. For most Christians, the story seems settled. Jesus is crucified. Jesus rises. Jesus appears to his followers. Then he ascends, and the curtain falls. That is the version millions know. It is clean, familiar, and repeated so often that it feels complete. But some of the oldest religious traditions in the world tell us something unsettling. They suggest the 40 days after the resurrection may have held teachings that never made it into the Christian mainstream. And once you hear that possibility, the silence around it starts to feel louder than the claim itself. The center of this mystery is a book many people have heard named, but very few have actually explored. The Book of Enoch. To some, it is a strange ancient text full of visions, angels, judgment, and secrets. To others, it is a dangerous book, one that sits too close to the Bible for comfort and too far outside the official canon for safety. It was known in the ancient world. It influenced early Jewish thought. It left fingerprints on later religious writing. Yet most churches today treat it like a shadow at the edge of the room. That alone should make you pause. Because the Book of Enoch was not some random modern invention. It was known long before the medieval church. Parts of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. That means ancient Jewish communities considered it important enough to copy, preserve, and protect. Early Christian writers also knew it. Some quoted it, some respected it. And the New Testament letter of Jude even directly cites Enoch by name. So this is not a fringe text that appeared out of nowhere. It lived close to the roots of biblical history. Yet somewhere along the way, much of the Christian world pushed it aside. Why? That question is where this story becomes dangerous. Because the issue was never just whether Enoch was old, the issue was what Enoch seemed to open up. It presented a world full of cosmic rebellion, forbidden knowledge, corrupt powers, and a conflict behind human history. A conflict that was bigger, older, and darker than many later church leaders wanted to emphasize. Enoch does not give you a safe religious system. It gives you a battlefield. And if there were traditions connected to Jesus after the resurrection that echo that same worldview, then the stakes become enormous. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine the risen Jesus not only comforting his disciples, but also explaining hidden realities. Imagine him warning them that truth would be mixed with distortion. Imagine him telling them that later generations would inherit institutions, rituals, and teachings that looked holy on the outside, yet quietly buried the deeper message underneath. If a tradition like that existed, it would not just add detail to the faith story, it would challenge power. That is why this topic refuses to die. Now, we need to be careful. There's a huge difference between what can be proved, what is strongly suggested, and what has grown through legend. If we are honest, the Book of Enoch itself does not contain a simple chapter titled, "Here are the exact recorded sentences of Jesus after the resurrection." Anyone who says the evidence is that clean is moving too fast. Ancient texts do not work that way. Manuscript traditions are complicated, fragments break, languages shift, margins collect notes, stories travel through centuries of copying. So, if we are going to enter this subject, we have to do it with both curiosity and discipline. But careful does not mean blind. Here's the first thing that matters. Enoch survived most fully inside the Ethiopian tradition. While much of the Western Church left it out, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept it. That means an entire ancient Christian tradition treated Enoch not like a forbidden oddity, but like something worth preserving. That alone destroys the idea that Enoch was always dismissed by all serious believers. It was not. Some Christians guarded it, while others abandoned it. And whenever one branch of the faith keeps a text that another branch rejects, you have to ask what was being protected and what was being filtered out. The mystery deepens when people connect Enoch to the post-resurrection period of Jesus. The New Testament tells us that Jesus spent 40 days with his disciples after rising from the dead. 40 days. That is not a passing moment. That is a season. Long enough for teaching, long enough for warning, long enough for explanations the public crowd never heard. But the canonical Gospels do not give us a full transcript of those days. They give glimpses, appearances, moments, instructions. Then the story moves on. That gap has haunted readers for centuries. What was said in those 40 days? What did Jesus choose to explain after the crucifixion, after fear, after betrayal, after the disciples had seen the impossible with their own eyes? If ever there were a time for final clarity, it was then. Yet the record we commonly receive is brief, and when history leaves a gap, other traditions rush to fill it. Some of those traditions were obviously late and imaginative. Some were devotional, some were symbolic, but others seem to preserve older questions, older anxieties, and older lines of thought that never fully disappeared. This is where Enoch becomes so powerful. not because it gives us a neat answer, but because it preserves a theological world that sounds uncannily close to the hidden side of early Christianity. In Enoch, history is not just human politics, it is spiritual conflict. Knowledge can be corrupted. Heavenly beings can rebel. Civilizations can be shaped by forces that appear bright while spreading ruin. Judgment does not arrive only at the end. It builds beneath the surface while people call evil normal and call confusion wisdom. Does that sound remote to you? Or does it sound uncomfortably modern? Think about the world we live in. Endless information but shrinking clarity. Institutions asking for trust while losing credibility. People surrounded by messages, experts, systems, and platforms that all claim authority. While ordinary men and women feel more spiritually disoriented than ever, the ancient fear was not just open persecution. It was deception dressed as guidance, error wrapped in truth, corruption delivered through the language of enlightenment. That is exactly why Enoch still unsettles people. Because it does not picture darkness as obvious. It pictures darkness as educated. And now the connection to Jesus after the resurrection becomes even more intense. If the risen Christ spoke into that kind of world, what would he have said? Would he have simply repeated public teachings everyone already heard? Or would he have prepared his closest followers for the age that was coming? Would he have spoken about empires, false religion, compromised leaders, and the slow burying of truth beneath ceremony and control? Many people suspect that the most disruptive teachings are always the ones least likely to survive in official form. Not because truth is weak, but because institutions are protective. Every institution, even a religious one, has a temptation. Preserve order, protect legitimacy, defend the structure. And once a structure becomes powerful, it often learns to prefer manageable truth over dangerous truth. It likes teachings that support obedience, not teachings that force deep re-examination. It likes mystery when mystery is decorative, but not when mystery becomes a threat to authority. So when people ask, why was Enoch banned? The answer is more complex than one meeting, one decree, or one villain. Texts are not always erased because they are fake. Sometimes they are sidelined because they are inconvenient. Sometimes they pull the story in directions leaders cannot control. And Enoch does exactly that. It speaks of powers behind powers. It suggests corruption did not begin only in human hearts, but also through spiritual contamination. It imagines a history where forbidden knowledge can reshape cultures. It frames the human story as part rebellion, part captivity, part awakening. And if early Christians read some of that through the lens of Jesus, then Enoch was not just old literature, it was dangerous interpretive fire. Here is where many modern viewers feel the tension rising. Because once you say that, another question appears. Did the early church remove Enoch because it contradicted Jesus, or because it amplified implications some leaders wished to soften? That is not a small question. If Enoch only contained harmless oddities, few would care. But if it preserved a worldview that made the teachings of Jesus feel sharper, stranger, and more confrontational, then its disappearance from much of mainstream Christianity starts to look less accidental. And this is where the emotional center of the story hits. Most believers do not fear fake gospels. They fear being cut off from something real. They fear that somewhere between the first century and the modern church, the rawness of the message was polished down, that the parts most likely to wake people up were labeled obscure, extreme, symbolic, or unsafe, that what remained was true, but incomplete, familiar, but thinner, holy, but easier to manage. If you feel that tension building, pause here for a second and do something simple. Leave a comment with the word searching, subscribe if you want more deep dives like this, and share this video with someone who still believes hard questions can lead to honest faith. Now let's get even closer to the heart of the issue. When people say, the church banned Enoch, they often imagine one dramatic moment where powerful men gathered in a room and decided to hide the truth forever. Real history is usually messier than that. Different communities used different texts. Some writings were widely read, others were debated. Some gained authority in one region and faded in another. Over time, the Western Church narrowed its canon, while the Ethiopian Church preserved a wider one. That matters because it changes the question. The question is not simply, did someone destroy Enoch? The better question is, why did some communities keep hearing the voice of this text while others slowly trained themselves not to? That is a more revealing question, because forgetting can be just as powerful as burning. You do not always have to destroy a book to make it disappear. You only have to stop teaching it, stop copying it, stop quoting it, and stop treating it like it matters. After enough generations, silence does the rest, and silence is one of the strongest forces in religious history. What makes Enoch even more fascinating is the way it overlaps with themes that later Christians would never fully escape. Angels and demons, heavenly thrones, final judgment, books being opened, cosmic rebellion, the Son of Man. These are not tiny side themes, they are major features of the biblical imagination. Enoch did not invent all of them, but it gathered them into a powerful apocalyptic vision long before most people realize. So when Jesus steps into history and speaks about the kingdom of heaven, the coming judgment, the powers of darkness, and the Son of Man, he is not speaking into an empty room. He's speaking into a world already charged with expectation. That is why the Book of Enoch matters, even if a person never accepts it as scripture. It helps us hear the atmosphere of the age. It shows the spiritual grammar that many people in that era already understood. Without that context, some of the language of Jesus can sound softer, flatter, and less radical than it really was. And that takes us back to the resurrection. Because after the resurrection, the disciples were no longer hearing Jesus as curious followers. They were hearing him as shattered men being rebuilt. They had seen Rome kill him. They had seen fear break them. They had seen the impossible happen. Whatever he said in those days would have landed with total force, not as theory, as survival. Would he have spoken about mission? Absolutely. Would he have spoken about forgiveness? Without question. But would he also have spoken about deception, endurance, conflict, and the hidden pattern of history? It would be strange if he had not. The crucifixion itself had already exposed what happens when political power, religious insecurity, and spiritual blindness combine. That is why so many extra-biblical traditions focus on secret teaching after the resurrection. People sense that something more must have been said. They may not all be right. Some are clearly embellished. But the instinct behind them is understandable. 40 days of the risen Jesus should feel like a thunderstorm of meaning, and many readers suspect the official memory is only part of the storm. Now here's where the title of this video becomes personal. What Jesus actually said after the resurrection is a powerful phrase, but it can also be misleading if we use it carelessly. We should be honest. We do not possess a courtroom recording from those 40 days. We do not have an undisputed page signed by all 11 disciples. What we have are traditions, echoes, fragments, patterns, and communities of preservation. That is less than certainty, but it is more than nothing. Sometimes history survives not as a spotlight, but as scattered sparks. And when enough sparks land in the same direction, people start to wonder whether a fire once burned there. The Ethiopian preservation of Enoch is one of those sparks. The Dead Sea Scroll fragments are another. Early Christian awareness of Enoch is another. The New Testament's own citation of Enoch is another. The wide ancient interest in post-resurrection teaching traditions is another. None of these alone proves the dramatic claim in our title. But together, they create a pressure point. They force the honest observer to admit that the boundaries of early Christian thought were wider, stranger, and more contested than many modern believers realize. That realization alone can change you. Because once you see that the early world of faith was not tidy, you stop treating inherited certainty as original truth. You begin listening more carefully. You begin asking which voice is won, which voice is lost, and why. You begin noticing how often history is written not only by the faithful, but by the organized. And then the Book of Enoch stops being a curiosity. It becomes a mirror. A mirror asking whether our age also rewards manageable religion over disruptive truth. Look around. We live in a time when spiritual language is everywhere, yet spiritual depth often feels absent. People quote verses, post sermons, sell devotion, and build platforms. But many are starving for a faith that explains why the world feels so fractured. A faith that can account for evil without trivializing it. A faith that can stare into corruption without pretending everything is simple. A faith that can speak about salvation without ignoring the war over the human soul. That hunger is one reason ancient banned texts keep returning. People are not always chasing rebellion. Often they are chasing weight. They are looking for the density that disappears when religion becomes polite, marketable, and emotionally safe. Enoch has weight. It feels dangerous because it is not trying to make you comfortable. It is trying to make you aware. And if some stream of early belief connected that awareness to the words of the risen Jesus, then you can see why the idea grips the imagination so strongly. Not because it flatters curiosity, but because it seems to answer a modern ache. The ache that says something has been reduced, something has been cleaned up, something deep may have been left outside the frame. Whether that feeling is fully right or partly wrong, it is real. And the church has often underestimated how powerful that feeling can become when people discover for themselves that ancient Christianity was more diverse than they were taught. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Once a believer learns that one major ancient church preserved Enoch while much of the West did not, the old shortcut no longer works. You can no longer dismiss the book by saying, real Christians never accepted this. Some did, some still do. And that means the debate is not closed. It was never closed. It was inherited as closed. That is a very different thing. If this conversation is opening your eyes, save this video for later, hit subscribe so you do not lose this series, and send it to somebody who has felt that official answers are not always the full story. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with three possibilities. The first is that all of this is mostly overreach. Enoch matters historically, but the dramatic claims about Jesus after the resurrection go far beyond the evidence. In that view, the mystery is interesting, but many modern storytellers are exaggerating the gaps. The second is that the evidence is incomplete, yet deeply suggestive. In that view, Enoch and related traditions do not give us certainty, but they preserve a conceptual world that may indeed carry traces of what the earliest followers believed Jesus revealed after rising. The third is the most explosive, that somewhere in the layers of transmission, fragments of suppressed teaching really do survive. Not cleanly, not perfectly, but enough to show that the public Christian story was streamlined over time. Which of those three is true? That depends on how you weigh fragments, traditions, communities, and silence. But notice something important. Even the cautious middle option is already significant. Even if we avoid sensational claims, the evidence still tells us that Enoch was ancient, influential, preserved by serious believers, and later sidelined. It also tells us that early faith communities lived with a much richer and more apocalyptic imagination than modern church culture often allows. That means the real challenge is not just about one hidden text. It is about whether we are willing to admit how much of the early spiritual universe has been flattened in later retellings. And maybe that is why this topic feels so alive. Because the modern person is drowning in information and starving for meaning. We do not only want facts, we want to know whether the world is deeper than it looks. Whether history contains buried warnings. Whether faith once named dangers that modern language tries to smooth over. Whether Jesus spoke to realities more unsettling than the comfortable versions we often inherit. That search can lead people into fantasy, yes, but it can also lead them into honest re-examination. And honest re-examination is not the enemy of faith. Fear is. The most mature faith is not the one that hides from hard material. It is the one that can face difficult texts, disputed traditions, and historical complexity without collapsing. A fragile faith demands censorship. A living faith can examine, test, discern, and remain open to truth. Maybe that is part of the lesson here. Maybe the Book of Enoch keeps resurfacing because every generation has to decide whether it wants comfort or depth, whether it wants closure or understanding, whether it wants religion as a fence or truth as a fire. And fire is exactly the right image, because once a question catches fire in the human mind, authority alone cannot put it out. You can dismiss a book, you can marginalize a tradition, you can narrow a canon, you can train generations to look away. But if the question at the center remains alive, it eventually returns. And the question here is unforgettable. That question is why people keep opening Enoch. Not because every claim around it is proven, not because every theory is sound, but because beneath the speculation sits a real historical fact. Something ancient, influential, and spiritually electric was pushed to the edge. Yet it never vanished. It survived in manuscripts. It survived in citations. It survived in other churches. It survived in fragments buried in caves. And above all, it survived in the suspicion that the earliest believers may have carried a sharper map of reality than many of us inherited. That suspicion is powerful because it touches more than history. It touches identity. If the roots were deeper, then perhaps our hunger is not a sign of rebellion. Perhaps it is a sign of memory. Perhaps people keep returning to these texts because they sense that faith was once more cosmic, more dangerous, more demanding, and more alive. And maybe the biggest reason this matters is not that the church banned one book. Maybe it matters because of what banning always reveals: fear, control, boundaries. The instinct to decide in advance what ordinary people are allowed to wrestle with. Yet truth has a habit of surviving gatekeepers. That may be the deepest lesson of all. And that is where this stops being only a debate about manuscripts and starts becoming a test of the heart. What do we do when a question threatens the version of faith that feels safest to us? Do we run from it? Do we mock it? Do we bury it under slogans? Or do we sit with it long enough to let it expose what we really trust? Some people are afraid that opening ancient disputed texts will destroy belief. But in many cases, the opposite is true. The deeper danger is pretending that faith can survive only in a sealed room, untouched by history, complexity, or hard evidence. A truth that cannot survive examination usually survives only by protection. And protected beliefs often become weaker, not stronger. That is why so many people who begin asking questions about Enoch are not trying to leave faith behind. They are trying to recover seriousness. They are trying to find a version of belief that can handle mystery without panic and can handle uncertainty without surrender. They are looking for a faith that does not flinch when the past turns out to be more complicated than the sermon version. And maybe that search, difficult as it is, brings them closer to the kind of honesty real discipleship requires. Whether or not the most dramatic version of this story can ever be fully proved, the pattern is unmistakable. What is excluded is not always worthless. What is preserved at the edges is not always false. What is called dangerous is sometimes simply difficult to control, And when you place that insight beside the empty tomb, the result is unforgettable. You begin to realize that the story of early Christianity may be less like a neatly edited book and more like a struggle over memory itself. A struggle over which words would be repeated. A struggle over which warnings would be softened. A struggle over which vision of Jesus would shape the future. That is why this subject refuses to stay buried. Because in the end, people are not only asking about Enoch, they are asking whether the voice at the center was larger than the system built around it. They are asking whether resurrection was followed by revelation that history only partially carried forward. They are asking whether the missing pieces still glow under the dust. And if they do, then the real danger was never the book. The real danger was what might happen if ordinary people read it, compared it, wrestled with it, and started hearing old faith with new ears. If this stirred something in you, do one last thing before you go. Like this video if you want more hidden history investigations, subscribe so you catch the next one, and share this with someone who is brave enough to follow the evidence even when it unsettles them. Because maybe the final question is not whether the Book of Enoch was banned. Maybe the final question is why so many people still feel, deep down, that something important was left out.